So I'm returning to scene 3 in the first part of the Ring of the Nibelung before we move into Act 1, which is the Valkyries. I briefly touched on scene 1 and 2 previously, and we've looked at how people can be tempted for various reasons, some crude, some subtle, to turn to rings of power, which they think are going to give them the meaning they search for in life, and how they sacrifice their soul. They gain their, as it were, their own desires, longings, but they lose their soul in the process. Alberic is one, and Wotan is the other. Wotan has essentially built this magnificent castle, as it were, Valhalla, where the gods come, but the price he's paid is he's had to silence the very springs of life in him, Freya, who makes the apples that give immortality, and he sold her to the giants who have built the castle. He knows he's wrong in what he's done. He knows the gods are dying because they've increasingly so silenced the very spirit within them that gives life for external mansion. And so he has to make a deal. How does he get Freya back? And he has learned that Alberic, deep in Nibelheim, the caves, is immensely wealthy, and he treats the other Nibelungs terribly as slaves to increase his wealth. And so Wotan and Logi realize that they have to go from the mountaintop of exquisite splendor and power, but you lose your soul in the process of getting it, down into the depths to get the gold of Alberic so they can pay off the giants, Fasolt and Fafnir, to get Freya back because the gods are dying. So down they go. So the third scene in part 1 of the Ring of the Nibelung is Loki, the crafty, the conniver person who will change truth. He will shift guises, he will calculate to get what he wants, goes with Wotan down into the depths of darkness. As he goes in there, because what they're wanting essentially is the gold to pay the giants so they can get Freya back, who gives them life. So they go down. They get in then to the depths of the Nibelungs to discover Alberic is torturing, beating, driving the Nibelungs into slavery. More and more gold, nonstop. Work, 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 produce, produce, produce. So they become addicted to things that give, at the one hand, a sense of wealth and prosperity, and another hand, deep emptiness they have. Now they go into the mines, and you've got the sibling rivalry in the mines between Alberic and Mimi. They're always at one another. Mimi is a craftsperson. He's made a helmet, as it were, the Tarnhelm, that if you put it on, you become invisible and you can change shape in any way you want. So between the ring of power and the Tarnhelm, you become invisible. Odin or Wotan and Logi go deep into the mines, and they become acutely aware that they need these two things, but they are also aware that Alberic knows how to become invisible, a protean self, to get what he wants. So when the crude power doesn't work, he will change shape, he will change form, he will become invisible, just like any conniving, manipulative person will. They will, and that can happen in politics, it can happen in religion. A calculating person will assume different guises of empathy, of sympathy, of listening, of attentiveness, but it's calculated to get something at the end of the day. Wotan and Logi go down there. They flatter Alberic, and they say, "Oh, magnificent what you've got, the gold you have." They don't discuss how he's got the gold, how he's treated the Nibelungs. And so they begin to ask, "Oh, you've got this lovely helmet you put on, you disappear. What can you make yourself?" So Alberic ever wanting to prove himself, because deep down all this power masks a profound insecurity, a sense he's been rejected all of his life. So he's going to use power to get acceptance by dominating. So those who were once dominated become the dominators. And so Loki, being the calculating, he knows how to manipulate Alberic by flattery. And, oh, you can be this great dragon, can you? But anybody can be a dragon, be afraid of. But how will you hide from your enemies? Can you make yourself very, very small? And so Alberic takes the bait. He becomes a frog. And so at that point, Loki just steps on him and grabs him. And he and Odin then leave the caves, the darkness of the depths where the Nibelungs are, and return with the gold and return with the ring back up to the mountaintop again. So now they can pay the giants what they want, and they can get Freya back. Freya again is the spring of life. She's the spirit, as it were, almost the Holy Spirit in that sense, that brings life to the gods in Valhalla, and Wotan has betrayed her. So they get up there, and of course they bring all the gold. And one of the giants, Fasolt, he's very attracted to Freya, unlike Fafnir, who's just sheer gold and wealth and power. And now the problem with the ring, of course, Alberic said anyone who takes this ring will become enslaved by the ring. So there's a curse on the ring that he or she who takes it, rather than controlling the ring will control them. In many ways, very similar to what Tolkien's doing in Lord of the Rings. The ring eventually controls the person who carries the ring, and rather than them being controller of the ring, they become addicted. And so what Wagner's getting at here, of course, is be careful of the rings we forge and hold, because they may betray us, and we think we're free, but in fact we become enslaved to the very things we're attached to. Very astute observation psychologically. But anyway, what Wotan and Loki, so they return to the heights. They give the gold to the giants. But Fasolt, the gold is not enough, because there's a chink in all the gold, and you can still see Freya. And he has to block out Freya. So it's like this magnificent castle of gold, but there's a little window in it, in which Fasolt can still see Freya, and the gold doesn't hold him as much as it does Fafnir, but he needs to block out Freya from his attractions. And so finally they demand that Wotan give them the ring. Wotan now is addicted to the ring. So just as Alberic was, Wotan can't give it away. And at this point, Erda appears, or Earth. So you have three women in this part that constantly, one is the Rhine maidens, who represent nature versus those who would exploit nature. Then you have Freya, the one who gives life, and what happens when we deny the very waters of life that can flow in our soul. And Erda is earth itself, and she comes to Wotan and she says, you must let go of this ring. It's not going to give you power. You are going to be enslaved by it. And initially, because he's so attached to it, he can't give it away. And she says, the gods are coming to an end. It's going to be over soon, because rather than you being free, you are addicted. You're attached. And the power of the ring is enslaving you. And increasingly, you're going to shrink, and the gods will disappear, the gods we have known. Important to understand what Wagner's getting at here is he was very influenced by Schopenhauer and others, and the big questions that's often is asked is whose version of the gods or God? How much of our understanding are just sheer projections and socialization? And what gods must die for the true God to appear? And so Wagner's The Ring of the Nibelung was considered one of the great breakthrough works. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, one has to overcome Wagner to move on, because Wagner's doing in The Ring of the Nibelung in an operatic, poetic, philosophical form rather than abstract philosophy, is articulating what happens when our view of the gods die. Where do we go from there at that point? And of course the final act in The Ring of the Nibelung is the twilight of the gods. The gods that we think are real, that we have internalized, are in fact just matters of socialization, enculturation, or projections. And so even how we read texts, for example, how much of they come from our own culturation. This ends then really the introduction to the Ring of the Nibelung. And then we move into section or Act 1, which is the Valkyrie. Begins with Sigmund stumbling into the house in the forest. His name is Man of Sorrows. He himself, his father, deserted when he was young. His mother was killed. He lost his sister. It's a story of a person whose life is tragic. He always tries to do what is right, what is just. Sigmund does, but whatever he does goes wrong. And what Wagner is getting at is there are those, what Heidegger says, their thrownness, the beginning is painful, the decisions they try and make lead to negative consequences, there's tragedy. And so he's fled, Sigmund has, from saving this woman from an unhealthy marriage in which her life itself would become entrapped and caged in a relationship. She gets into the house, there's nobody home, he collapses, and from one of the rooms comes Sieglinde. She's intuitively drawn. She's married to Hunting. It was a forced marriage. It's an unhappy marriage. It's a painful marriage for Sieglinde, but she has no other choice. But she's intuitively drawn to Sigmund, and he begins to unravel his story. And she doesn't understand the attraction. They're both people who were, they don't know their past, but they live very painfully. Their upbringing was tragic and difficult. The lives they live are constantly thwarting any meaningful step towards meaning and purpose. And even when they try to do something right, it inevitably goes wrong. So what Wagner is getting at is there are those in life in which their thrownness is not optimistic, it's not painful, and it's not necessarily likely to unravel in a meaningful way. But you have Sieglinde very, very much senses in Sigmund something she has an affinity to. She doesn't know what it is. In comes Hunting, her husband. He's a sort of almost a barbaric type, crude sort of guy. Force and swords and violence and war is what defines what it means to be a man, the macho male, the alpha male, sensitive as a brick wall to the longings of Sieglinde and her hopes and meanings for a meaningful relationship. And so as Sigmund begins to tell her story, Hunting realizes that the person that Sigmund has killed to save this woman is one of his kinsmen. And he's giving him shelter, but based on the Teutonic notion of if you have a guest, you can't do any hurt or harm to them that night, then he says, I'll give you the night of hospitality, but tomorrow we fight. Sieglinde gives him his nightly drink. Her husband was tinctured a little bit with a sleeping potion. And once he's sleeping, then Sieglinde and Sigmund begin to talk about their histories, and they begin to thread together uncertainties, the mystery of their upbringing, who are they, what's their identity, what's their future, and they begin to hear similar stories of a past that they have not known how to interpret. They don't know where they come from. They don't know why they're in situations the way they are, but they sense in one another the ability to hear. And she begins to realize very clearly that in fact, Sigmund is her brother, who was sired by Wotan. Wotan, again, is an interesting example of what Wagner is getting at in the 9th century. There is this combination, not only politically, but a certain understanding of the gods, of sheer liberty and power. And God can do what God wants. God is sovereign. And who is anyone to tell God what to do? In one sense, you get this played out in, say, the book of Job, where Job begins to ask questions about his suffering, and God turns up, where were you when I made this? And where you're sort of overcome by rhetorical power and violence and images, and so you can't ask any questions. Or the God who creates the flood in Noah, destroying innocent animals, or choosing a nation and committing genocide to others, wiping out animals, probably innocent people. The or pleading with Sodom and Gomorrah, wipe out the whole place, even if there's 10, 5, 3. So Wotan, in that sense, has a lot of affinities with not only Zeus in elements of Greek myth, but also the god of the Jewish tradition. And in that sense, Wagner was often accused of anti-Semitism, but he's also railing against a notion of God is found in the Hebrew canon, elements of the Hebrew canon, that is this sovereign will, choice, freedom, and how dare you question me? I can do as I wish. And so how do humans find their way in a relationship with a God which is authoritarian, totalitarian, demands obedience, and if one dares to differ, the thunder comes, the lightning comes, the Ark of the Covenant is tossed over and people holding it are killed immediately. What kind of a divine being is? So what Wagner is doing in the 19th century, he's deconstructing elements of the Hebrew canon, but he's doing it through Teutonic myth. And so he's not like he'd run head on directly with sort of biblical interpretation, but he's doing it sideways in his approach. And so Wotan, in this sense, the sense that I can build Valhalla, who is anyone to question what I do with my wealth, my property? I can have illicit, adulterous relationship. Who is anyone to tell me what I can do or not? So underlying all this is the free, sovereign, liberty-choosing, willful being, which of course Wagner is going to make it very clear. This is a key element of the emerging 19th century way of thinking. It impacts industry and much else, and so which then kills the Freas, kills the Erdas, that marginalize the Rhine maidens. And so at the end of actually part 1, you have the Rhine maidens below and the gods crossing the rainbow bridge into Valhalla, and they're lamenting the gods have ignored the songs of nature in building their massive palaces and what they have bartered to get what they want. Now, as the story unfolds, is that Hunting is going to fight Sigmund the next day, and Wotan, this is his son, who believes that Sigmund is going to rescue the gods. But Frigga says, how dare you support Sigmund? He's had intercourse with his sister. You had an illicit affair to produce these two. You've undermined family, security, predictability, everything that is good and true in your notion of the will and power. No content to your freedom, to your willing, even though you talk about order and structure and law and justice. In reality, you do what you want, when you want, how you want. And so the two children, Sieglinde and Sigmund, are really the child of liberty and will, unconstrained, appetite swollen to the point of I do what I want. In that sense. So Frigga confronts Wotan. She says, how dare you protect Sigmund in this fight with Hunting? In doing so, you are not only in a position in which you're legitimating the children you've birthed, but you're legitimating brother and sister having intercourse. And this is a double violation of any minimal ethical standard. So he tries to work his way around all this, and she just holds him again and again to the corner. And so what he has to do, he essentially he told his favorite daughter, the queen of the Valkyries, Brunhilde, that she was to defend Sigmund in his battle against Hunting. But in Wotan's discussion with Frigga, he relents, and he begins to say, okay, you're not to protect Sigmund. Brunhilde isn't, and he has to die. And the great hopes that Wotan had in the terms of the gods seemingly coming to an end was that Sigmund would bring about a new era. Now, what happens as this unfolds in the Valkyries is just as you have these uncertainty of brother and sister, what you have is Brunhilde begins to question as she watches how Sigmund is willing to die for Sieglinde, because she's very much at a certain point, Dad knows best. He's the authority. He's the God. He tells us what to do. We rescue this. But here's in fact a brother and a sister demonstrate sacrificial love for one another, and Wotan is punishing them for it. And he made the decisions that created this. And she watches the tenderness of Sigmund and Sieglinde, and so she's torn between her father's expectations of her and a growing sense of mercy within her. To how does she care for this couple that Wotan is deserting, just leaving? Where is love, essentially, in Wotan? Where is mercy in Wotan? Where is justice in Wotan when it comes to his own children that he cares for? And so Brunhilde goes through this deep inner transformation in which she begins to protect. She couldn't fully protect Sigmund in the battle, but she saves Sieglinde and gets her out from the wrath of Wotan. And of course, this infuriates her father immeasurably. So Dad just turns on daughter, and it's, "You've betrayed me. What kind of a daughter are you? I held you near and dear. You were the most important thing in my life, and now what I've asked you and told you to do, you violated me." And so what's going on here, of course, Wagner is looking at parent-child relationships, but not only parent-child at a literal level, but the notion of ultimate being and humans. So humans is the children and God is the parent. And what happened when the parent is oppressive or brutal or oppressive? Do you just obey? Because that's what the ultimate reality is like. And in a literal sense, do you just obey parents uncritically, even if they're asking unjust things to be done? Where in the process is love, mercy, and compassion in this. And so Brunhilde, in the Valkyries, for she is the queen of the Valkyries, and Wotan turns on her viciously he rides, and the Valkyries are protecting her as she brigs Sieglinde, trying to harbor her, and they surround her so that Wotan can't see her, but in his wrath and anger, he's ready to turn against the Valkyries and says, "Where is Brunhilde?" And so finally she comes forward for fear of him turning his thunderbolts in anger on the Valkyries. And there's a very touching scene, actually, in Wotan begins to reflect on both how he appears as a frightening being of ultimate power, but also his own internal ruminations on why is he acting the way he's acting? Why is he treating his daughter the way he is? It's an interesting conjecture of Wagner of getting inside the mind of God. Of the justice side, the mercy side, and how is that squared, and how do you make sense of that in treatment of humans? Because one can say, "This is my law, this is the demands I make of you. If you disobey, these are the implications." On the other hand, where is the mercy, the patience, the long-suffering, the kindness in that? So there's an interesting, almost internal dialogue with Wotan. Is he realizes he's torn between treating his daughter in a certain way, that she deserves to be punished, she has disobeyed him, and yet in doing so he's going to lose his daughter. He's going to alienate his daughter, the one that's as closest to his heart. So there's this fascinating internal dialogue within Wotan himself between, on the one hand, his sense of who he is and brooks no disobedience, no opposition, and punishment must occur. On the other hand, what is he praying in terms of mercy, in terms of kindness with his daughter by making such decisions? And so it's a very touching scene in the Valkyries, but Brunhilde has managed to smuggle Sieglinde away, hidden him from Wotan, into the cave. And of course, Sieglinde is going to give birth to Siegfried, which takes you into Act 2, who's going to play a very significant role. But throughout sort of the Part 1 and then Act 1, the Rhinegold and then the Valkyrie, Wagner is working at a whole range of levels. Theologically, whose version of God? What do you do if you see God in a certain way? What's the implication of that for family relationships, for parental relationships, for political relationships? What do we turn to for meaning? What are the idols that will betray us if we're not aware of what goes on? What happens when children literally confront parents, and they're more truthful than their parents in what they're doing, and what happens metaphorically when people confront an understanding of God, when God seems to be unjust. Do those gods have to die? And are the humans who confront those gods? I mean, Nietzsche uses the twilight of the idols. He's drawing from Wagner, of course, the twilight of the gods in what he's doing just further on in some of his works. But in Lord of the Rings, of course, what's happening is what is going on in Mordor under Sauron is exactly the same as what's going on with Alberic and the Nibelung. And the Nibelheim is the same as Mordor. The ring is one that people get addicted to. It dominates them. And knowing how to let go of addictions, regardless of the shape, the size they take, can often be very, very difficult. And there's a lot of pain involved in that. And so what you have running through these first two parts is the longing for positive endings, a comedic, and yet shot through in all of this is the tragic realities of choices made and consequences lived with. And Wagner is going to work on this comedic, tragic tension, which Nietzsche will pick up on. And of course, The Birth of Tragedy is very much written a commentary on the Ring of the Nibelung as well. But certainly Tolkien, this notion of the ring of power, the addiction, and having to get rid of it. And of course, by the end of the Ring of the Nibelung, the ring is returned, but the ending is quite different than Tolkien's Catholic ending, which is optimistic in a Dante-esque form, unlike the Ring of the Nibelung, which is more tragic. And so Wagner, like Nietzsche, are willing to look into the tragic elements of life. And the story isn't always a happy ending, and a lot of the protagonists and antagonists in the Ring of the Nibelung, in that sense, it's more complex, more layered, and willing to look at unresolved issues, ambiguous issues, living in the tension of the tragic and the comedic. Next presentation, I'll then move into Siegfried, who is the child of Siegmund and Sieglinde, and he grows up being trained deep in the caves, and he has to reforge the sword that was given to Siegmund that was destroyed in his battle with Hunding, and Siegfried's maturation, and then again having to break with someone he thought was a parent. And Wagner's always working on those people we admire. We think they're people who are training us to be our better selves, but in fact they're using us to serve other purposes, or their understanding of what the good life is highly problematic. And Siegfried is going to have to break with Mimi, just as Brunhilde had to challenge Wotan. Frigga has to challenge Wotan. So the Ring of the Nibelung is a series of conflicts and challenges and overcomings that, and then in Act 2, Siegfried begins to take us even deeper into this theological, philosophical, sibling, family conflicts, and we'll see the return, of course, of Alberic again, but that will be Act 2 of was a 3-day, actually a 4-day event, the Ring of the Nibelung in Beirut in Germany, which is still very popular today.